with that, I'm going to turn you guys over to Darius.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. How are you? A little bit talked out and a little bit tired. Cecilia and I have been on like the road trip presentation, Road Warrior path. We were both at SQL Saturday Orlando 10 days ago, and then 12 days ago, New York this Saturday, and now this. So I'm a little bit sleep deprived, so I'll do my best. But thank you everyone for coming. I want to thank Cecilia, Dave Noderer, and also Barca for all of their engagement and all their help with this group. There's some feedback with these mics tonight. Tell me if you want me to turn it off, I'll turn it off. It's good. Good? Okay. So today we're gonna basically, I can't say that this is covering any one specific certification path per se today. What we've decided to do was to come up with content that would effectively give everyone a good solid tour of the portal and experience what it's like to deploy things if you haven't already, or maybe look at things a little bit differently if you already have, so that this will kind of get everyone introduced to the environment, and then from there we can go ahead and actually dig further and deeper into all the different aspects and technologies. So we're going to do that, and we're also going to cover Active Directory, specifically Azure Active Directory. How many have heard of Active Directory? Okay. So this is Azure's flavor of the directory service. So we're going to talk about how that works within the Azure cloud, as well as a lot of other pieces that are dependent upon it. Virtual machines, which is effectively kind of where all the clouds started, and a topic that all of us are probably very familiar with on-premise. And we're familiar with the concept because we all have computers, right? So virtualization has been around for several years, obviously, and this is effectively the Azure cloud version of it. We're going to talk about app services, which is how can we deploy as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible a code that we've developed in .NET or other languages into the Azure cloud. So we'll go ahead and look at that. Each one of these sections, we're going to do a little bit of a demo or a video that I have that I linked to. And then we're just very briefly going to touch on Cloud Shell, which is a command line interface and developer's approach, or systems admin developer / developer approach to administering the Azure cloud. I think it's this speaker right up here. So what we'll do with that regard is that we're actually going to be able to touch on it here today, but I really want David Cobb's really passionate about the CLI, and he's probably going to have a whole session on it within a few months. We'll be able to deep dive on that. So, and we'll leave, if you have questions as we go, absolutely, please feel free to bring them up. We'll have a formal one at the end as time permits, okay? So looking again at the portal and Azure Active Directory specifically. The portal obviously is centralized administration for the Azure cloud, right? You can tailor the experience to yourself. There's colors that you can change the actual styles for and so forth. Also, if you have anyone with accessibility issues, some handicaps, you can also look at high contrast styles as well for the user interface. RBAC, which is called Role-Based Access Control, is the application of different roles that are predefined. You can also create your own roles if you'd like, custom roles, but they're predefined roles within Azure that you can assign to users or groups. And you can assign them at different levels in the hierarchy of what you've deployed. And we'll go through what that hierarchy looks like as soon as we hit into the demo. ARM, which is the Azure Resource Manager. How many of you have heard of Azure Classic? You've heard the term classic, okay. And even back in the AWS cloud, okay, there was a term of the classic VPCs. And what those were effectively were the first generations of each respective cloud's orchestrators and approaches and architectures to actually putting everything together and orchestrating it and getting it up and running. So ARM, which is I'd say, I don't know how long now would you say ARM has been around? It's been 8 years, 6 years?
Probably, maybe less than that, maybe
5, okay. Okay. So ARM was when Microsoft went through and they transitioned the portal. It used to look completely different, and then they revamped the portal. They also revamped the deployment model and how you actually can roll out these resources. So that's the current approach, and hopefully we'll stay there for some time. We'll talk about that. And then identity access management, which ties with role-based access control. Those kind of two go hand in hand. Identity access management is effectively saying I have these users, I have these groups, here's the authentication and for those users, and role-based access control is effectively the authorization of that throughout the actual infrastructure. I should have probably put those right next to each other. There's a billing, cost explorer, and budgeting. You can do all kinds of things and set triggers for budgets. So as soon as something exceeds your budget within a certain category, whether it's virtualization or whether it's databases or the entire subscription overall, you can have email alerts go off as well, and explore where your costs are, really taking place or where they're coming from. On Active Directory, there was a question, what's the difference between Microsoft 365 security and Azure security? And the best way that I can describe that is Microsoft 365 is Microsoft's holistic approach to desktop and mobile applications from a productivity suite, right? So it's taking Office 365 and related applications. It's also taking Windows 10, specifically, and more often than not, Windows 10 Enterprise, I believe, and taking those technologies and bundling them together, not only from a licensing standpoint, but also from a infrastructure and deployment and management standpoint. So when it comes to Microsoft 365 security, what Microsoft's referring to is effectively securing your Windows desktops, tied back to the cloud, by the way. You can actually have technologies in place there with your desktop login, your Windows Hello experience that actually go ahead and tie back to the Azure cloud and Azure Active Directory for the securing and authorization of a user on a device, even if it's mobile, out in the field, or at the office. So what's important is you'll see here that Azure Active Directory is a global directory service for all things Microsoft Cloud. It's not just for Azure. It's for Office 365. It's for the entire Microsoft 365 suite. It's for Dynamics 365. It's for Power BI, who Cecilia knows very well. And something that Cecilia, she's like the master of Power BI, at least that I know, okay? And I think when we touched on this, I wasn't even myself fully familiar with how that took place. When she provisioned Power BI for herself for the first time, it actually went in the background because she never had Office 365 for her domain. She didn't have Azure for her domain. It actually created an Azure Active Directory for her. It created a tenant, as it's called, Active Directory tenant, and it had all this going in the background she never even knew. So we together went through and explored what it had created just to get Power BI up and running. So it's an entire synergistic ecosystem, and it's super important to understand that and also to secure it and secure it properly. We'll go through that in the demo. And then Azure Active Directory can actually synchronize with your on-premise Active Directory, the traditional Windows Active Directory. I believe you can go as far back as Windows 2008, if I'm not wrong, but of course that's no longer supported by Microsoft officially, so let's just say 2012 and later. And the technology to do that, and a utility and a service that basically gets installed on-premise, is known as AD Connect. It used to be called DirSync, but now it's called AD Connect for the last several years. And it's basically a service that will synchronize from your on-premise to the cloud. You can choose to synchronize your entire Active Directory tree, or you can select which organizational units within your Active Directory tree you would like to synchronize up to the cloud. So you don't have to expose your entire user base. You don't have to expose your domain admins. You don't have to do so. You can actually keep those separate. So keep that in mind. It's sorry?
I just saw a presentation from Microsoft on a directory scheme where you could actually post your apps in the cloud and choose them because they show up on your desktop, but they're not actually on your desktop.
It's very true. So basically what we have with SCCM, who Vic can run circles around. Hi, Vic. So SCCM, Microsoft, Configuration Manager allows you to deploy applications to desktops throughout your enterprise. And Microsoft's taking that technology and incorporating it into Microsoft Intune, which is effectively the mobile device and application management suite that runs out of Azure. And you can do a lot of things that you used to do with SCCM to desktops and mobile devices now from Microsoft Intune from the cloud without ever deploying SCCM. So, multi-factor authentication, a topic that's dear to my heart and I'm passionate about, and I want you to be as well. I've gone into organizations, which will remain nameless, that still to this day, even larger ones, that are not running multi-factor authentication. And so how many of you have been challenged by your bank to enter the code, right, when it comes on your phone? Well, the technology is built into Microsoft Azure. There's no reason that you wouldn't want to turn that on for Azure, Office 365, et cetera, because at the end of the day, the same user account belongs where? It's coming from Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. All right, so this is just a diagram of AD Connect as I described it. There's different ways to set up AD Connect to synchronize your on-premise identities, your on-premise Active Directory with the cloud, right? So you can either choose to synchronize the hashes of your passwords. No one's going to guess your password this way or know your password except, you know, Microsoft using the technology that they have, which you already trust with your systems inside of Windows. So you're synchronizing the hash of those passwords so that when someone goes to authenticate in the cloud, that hash is already stored, and when Microsoft hashes what you provided, I'm sorry, sir, do you mind just stepping a little bit? We're recording the session for other people's benefit. You're perfect, right there, perfectly fine. So basically the hash is there, and it's present in the cloud for someone to go ahead and authenticate. If you lost connectivity with your on-premise Active Directory, they could still sign in. And that's a key thing to keep in mind, because if you configure pass-through authentication, each and every login request is actually going to have to go back to the on-premise AD Connect instance and say, here's the password that was provided, would you please authenticate it locally? Now, there could be an advantage to that. You as an organization may not want to even provide your hashes up to Microsoft, and you want to be true north, if so to speak, true north, and you want to be able to quickly disable users' access from Active Directory by disabling that user account, then the next login attempt is going to be rejected, okay? As opposed to waiting up to 30 minutes with password hash synchronization, which takes place every 30 minutes, and you cannot decrease, I don't believe, that interval any shorter time period than 30 minutes. A large enterprise, though, will use ADFS, which is Active Directory Federation Services, and they will set up at least 2 of these servers, virtual machines typically, that will actually be accessible to Microsoft and have a direct relationship for the authentication. And there's redundancy built in, you know, between the 2 instances. You might even have other instances in other locations for high availability. And that is effectively how most enterprises will actually do this authentication together. So they'll pass it through ADFS. And then, like we talked earlier, you can synchronize users and groups and other objects, and you can dictate which ones you want to synchronize or not. So with that, we're going to go into the demo here for the Azure portal and Active Directory. Any questions so far? All right, so let me go to the home screen here real quick. So when you first start on the portal, you will start either here on the home screen or you will start on the dashboard, which was the original view that Microsoft had originally created. And this dashboard is completely customizable to you. You can edit it, and you can drag things into it. You can move things around if you'd prefer it be located someplace else, and you can finish customizing it, and you can pin things all over throughout your entire account and your entire subscription inside of Azure, and move and effectively pin them to the dashboard and be able to come back and take a look at those things quickly, and also to get a cursory glance and look at what's taking place. So an example would be is we have this SQL Server instance. It's actually a MySQL database instance that David is working on. We're going to go ahead and actually pin this. You'll see that there's a push pin on every single, oh gosh, it's going to do this again. I can't zoom, sorry guys. But there's a push pin over here, and if I pin this, you'll see that it's pinned to the dashboard. I could click here. Anything you do in the dashboard and you see one of these toast pop-up notifications, you can actually click on the hyperlink and it'll take you straight to there, which is nice and helpful. Now you'll see down here I have the actual server, and it's stating that it's ready and it's ready to go, and different types of services and different types of objects inside of Azure will present differently here inside of the dashboard, and some of them will even allow you to customize what's being displayed on them at any given time. But let's just say that I wanted to, present this over here. I can, and I can, leave it there for my convenience.
You created a dashboard which you called My Dashboard because the default one just says dashboard.
Yeah, actually, the default one for this account was recently created only a month or 5-6 weeks ago. We did not call it My Dashboard. It actually got deployed this way, so it's possible that they're renaming what the dashboards are called from the get-go in this day and age, and that's something that you're going to experience. That's going to cause you some cognitive dissonance. You're going to be in Azure or in any of these clouds. They're changing nonstop, and you're just going to be like, I could swear that was there not just last week, last hour, and it's not there anymore. And that's just something that we just have to get used to as we work with these clouds, because they're just so dynamic is a great word. All right. So when you first land here, there's certain things here on the left-hand side that are favorites that are pinned by default. Most of these that you see here are already there. DNS zones is not, and I think that's the only one that I pinned to this. But I wanted to show you how you would pin other ones. And by the way, this is also very revealing of how many services there really are. So you can go to All Services, and you can see an entire list here under the All category. And we can effectively scroll through this list together. In fact, I'll just page through this list, and it just keeps going and going and going, and you get the idea. So there is a lot going on here, and that's why even within Microsoft itself, they've had to start separating out the cloud architects. There's the data architects, there's the generalist cloud architects, there's the security architects, the networking architects. Because there really is that much. Now you'll see the yellow star next to the ones that are actually pinned. We can pin additional things like subscriptions, for example, I just pinned, and now it appears here at the bottom. I could always drag this up, in sequence and work my way up to the top and say, you know what, I really want to see my subscriptions here at all given times. And to that, we'll actually go ahead and start with the topic of subscriptions. Because that's kind of where everything evolves and is centered from, along with Azure Active Directory. So we talked about Azure Active Directory, and we'll drill into that in just a second. But you'll see that it's showing a list of subscriptions, which are effectively billable entities. You could have multiple subscriptions inside of your account at any given time, split up by organizational unit, maybe your sales team, or let's say North America needs to bill out separate from South America, or Florida bills separate from Georgia, and you can actually break down your resources into different subscriptions and deploy your resources into those subscriptions, and have these billing boundaries that you can have there for some organization. You'll notice here that it's saying showing subscriptions for Microsoft Cloud South Florida. So Microsoft Cloud South Florida is the directory that we named this Azure Active Directory, that name, and you can switch directories. Now, if there was more than one directory inside of which there is, you'll see there's another directory here that was present when we first signed up. So when you first sign up, it will create a .onmicrosoft.com subdomain. In this case, it created the name of the email address that we had signed up with, which was MCSFUG gmail.com.onmicrosoft.com. But most of the time, the reason that is because we started it out inside of Azure. Okay, it started out with a personal email address. If you start out in Office 365, for example, it will ask you for a name of your current primary domain. Okay, let's just say that your primary domain is acme.com. Okay, so it will actually allow you to name your primary tenant domain inside of Microsoft acme.onmicrosoft.com. Now you can go and add your custom domain names to that, and they will show up, and you can tie them into your Active Directory. But what we have here are two directories. At this point, we've abandoned the default one, and the only reason that, again, this took place is because we signed up under Azure, not Office 365 when we did this. And we could effectively close that other directory down, but I'm just showing you, and left it there for the purposes of the demo. So you can have multiple directories that you can actually log into and administer inside of Azure, not just one. So we're using this directory right now, and we'll stay with that. and we've got these 2 subscriptions under this directory. And if we go into any one of these subscriptions, we can actually go in and see more details about that subscription. It tells me I'm the owner of this subscription, the type of subscription that it is, which is pay-as-you-go. When you first sign up, it's a free trial subscription, and that converts to a pay-as-you-go, and it basically charges to a credit card. You can set up terms with Microsoft as an organization and have monthly bills take place on net terms. And aside from that, this is effectively charging a credit card as it goes, right? And we have very little in here, so there's not much cost here to really go into and show. I wish I could show you something that's a little bit more impressive. And no, it doesn't just cost 2 cents to run your technologies and your services inside of Azure. But this gives you an idea of what you can do. And you see the push pin? I could push pin that to my dashboard. Maybe I want to keep this. In fact, let's just go ahead and do that. I want to go ahead and see that on my dashboard going forward from now on. We can do a cost analysis, which actually goes in and allows you to look by resource and resource type. What is it that I'm spending and how much am I spending on it? And we'll let this load. I guess I haven't actually pulled it up in this account. And I'm sorry that there isn't more data here yet. We just made this subscription effectively go live, so we're lacking some information in here. But you get the idea. You can change your dates. You can look at accumulated costs, cost by resource, what's actually going ahead and costing me the most. And right now it's telling me that these storage accounts are what's driving up cost today. And the reason is because I just moved resources into this account, into this subscription. Let's go back into the free trial subscription. We might be able to get a little bit more detail here, and now that's a little bit more realistic. You can see the forecasted growth as well, because it's been established and it can go ahead and tell me what my forecast is for the month. And then when you first sign up for Azure, you have certain services that are free for the first 12 months. And you can Google for those, you can find them. But here is a view into how much of those free services am I actually consuming as I go for the first 12 months. You get a credit in the first month of, how much is it?
$200.
$200. So when you first sign up, you get $200 to play for a month. So be diligent and get in there and play as much as you can. Then continuing on for an additional 11 months, you have these free services available to you. So there's a lot there that you can mess around with and get in trouble with. But budgets can be set. I won't go into the details here, but you can actually go ahead and actually set budgets on your subscription based on a certain resource within a certain scope. Is it in that subscription, or is it in something called a resource group, which we'll touch on in just a minute? And you can go ahead and set that there, and you can look at your invoices and payments and so forth. Any questions? All right. So going to Azure Active Directory, you will see that we've named it accordingly, and also we have a ability to set custom domain names. So you'll see that we actually have added a MCSFUG.com and .org, and we've verified those by using DNS entries inside of DNS to validate that we are the true owner of those domains. And you'll see that the Microsoft tenant root setup domain here for us is mcsfug.onmicrosoft.com. That means you can sign in with a user at any one of these domains, and still, as long as the user matches the username and the domain matches the domain, you can actually authenticate inside of Azure Active Directory.
Now, if you have a domain
Yes.
on some other service,
Yes.
an internet domain, and you want to move it to the cloud, what would you do? Just add it here and it would automatically move over, or what do you do with your old one?
Good question. You actually don't have to move your domain or your DNS into Azure. You can leave it in GoDaddy, you can leave it in AWS, you can leave it someplace else. Keeping in mind that certain things that you will deploy, if you want to use what's called the apex of the domain, you know how you go to a website without typing in www, you just type in the domain name. That's called the apex record. And the apex is can only be what's known as an A record, which is a host record. And that typically only points to an IP address. You cannot use an alias, which is known as a canonical name, CNAME, to point to at the root apex record. You have to have an A record for most DNS services. So here's what happens. When you're hosting things inside of any of these clouds, you're assigned IP addresses that are not necessarily static. They float, they shift because you're dealing with multiple geographies, you're dealing with load balancers, etc. So you need a DNS service that is inherently aware of what that IP address might be for your website or for your service at that given time, and only knowledge that's going to be present for that is the DNS service within that respective cloud, in this case Microsoft Azure. So if you want to use the apex record of your domain for a website, etc., and it's hosted inside of Azure, and it's on an IP address that's floating and changing behind a load balancer, geographically redundant, etc., you have to host DNS inside of that cloud, in this case Azure. And we've actually gone ahead and done that here. You'll notice here I've actually pinned DNS zones. I'll open this into another tab so that you can see, and we've actually hosted DNS into, this is taking a little precious time, but you can see that we've hosted those 2 domains there. Okay, and again, the reason is because then we can take the apex record for that actual, in this case, that's a bad example because I think we're not done setting it up, but let me just check on this one real quick. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give you the example except to say that you can point when you go ahead and add a record and you make it the root of the domain. You'll see that there's something here called alias record set. This is something that's built into the cloud DNS providers. As soon as I switch this to yes, it's actually going to allow me to pick a resource, which I don't have any at the moment, but you can see that I can pick a traffic manager or a CDN, a content delivery network that Microsoft is hosting. And if I have those deployed, they will show up here and I can actually pick them. And that associates that record with that service and dynamically returns an IP address every time that user makes a request. Okay.
What charges for hosting your DNS zone? Any additional charges?
Yeah, there's charges, and there's charges per resolution, per response, but they're absolute fractions of a penny. No, I'm serious. Large organizations I've seen just pay a couple bucks per month, so it's not excessive.
But
yes?
You typically going to want to do that with SSL also, right?
Yeah, so that's unrelated. This is just DNS to resolve the actual name. Mm-hmm. SSL is going to be a different conversation, and that would be something that you would terminate to a load balancer or to a web server, or a virtual machine. So we'll talk about that in a separate conversation, or if you want to come to me afterwards, we can talk about that. All right, any questions so far? So those are the custom domains. There's some neat things you can do with company branding. I won't go into it right now, but you have to get a premium license inside of Azure Active Directory to have this, but you can put your logo, you can put a disclaimer, you can put a warning message that unless you're with that organization, do not log in, etc. And you can do so here. And actually, that's very helpful because it helps users identify with the fact that it is your organization that they're logging into and they didn't mistype something. You have a question?
Where is this showing up? Yeah.
Branding. So when you go to log in to any of the Microsoft cloud services, Office 365 or what have you, instead of Microsoft's logo, you can put your company logo and branding information there. We talked about Azure AD Connect. This is where you would have the information and the status set up to see that your synchronization is actually taking place, and this is also where you would download the installer from if you'd like to, unless you Google for it, but this would be the official download point, and you'd install it and then you'd have the synchronization taking place here. Okay, we just don't have enough time to go through an actual deployment of it, but I would love to. So we talked about roles and administrators, and this is a list of all the different roles. We talked about role-based access control. These are all the built-in roles, but you can also create custom roles if you have a Azure AD Premium license, and you can define those yourself so that you can be a little bit more granular with what you do. But this is a list of all the roles. There's billing administrator, there's directory readers that can read data out of Active Directory, but they can't change it. The key role to all of Azure is a global administrator for the directory. So this role allows you to have full administrative access over everything inside of this Azure Active Directory and into the actual services that encompass it. So keep that in the back of your mind, because if you have global admin role, you can do anything, including tearing down the entire directory, tearing down your subscription. And while we don't have time to show it today, the best practice that you can have is make sure that any of your admin accounts, just like you would on-premise, best practices would have you have a separate set of domain admin accounts, right, from your typical user at your desktop. Don't be logged into Azure with admin rights into Azure and Office 365 from your primary user accounts. Create a separate account, open up an incognito or in private browsing session, log in that session, keep it separate from your primary browsing experience, and also obviously log out as soon as you're done. That's the best practice that I can give you. I do it all the time, and I'm pretty religious about it. Okay, so that kind of covers just a touching on the roles. There's a list of devices. If you had devices synchronized to the cloud, so your workstations will actually show up here, and you'll be able to see whether they're compliant or not based on policies that are set through Intune, as we talked about earlier, for device management. Let me back out here. And we have a list of users, just a standard list of users and groups concept. And Dave and I are setting this up as we go. So need to add some additional users here as well. So you can see that there's an Azure primary admin account at the top. Right now, all these users have administrative access because we don't have that broken down yet, but the best practice will be to keep that separate, okay? There's a sign-in activity log, which I need a premium license for. I wish I could have shown that to you. That works really nicely. You can see a list of all the sign-ins. Audit logs throughout the Azure portal are mostly administrative. What happened? This user was updated, this user was deleted, this user was added, this service was added, deleted, etc. So it's kind of like an audit trail, right? But it's not actual sign-ins. Those are seen underneath the sign-ins blade. And by the way, these are all called blades. When you hear the word blade, they're referring to each one of these because as you dig in, I can't actually, that's a bad example. Let me go back to users. As we dig into an object, you can dig in further and further and further and end up with more and more blades here to the right that we can scroll back through and see where we came from. And at any point in time, you can re-navigate, which is really nice and really helpful. You can also close out where you were at, and effectively return to your root session there. I don't think there's anything else that well, there's multi-factor. I did want to touch on that. So this here is just telling you that in order to have all of the bells and whistles of multi-factor, you need a premium premium trial to enable it for Active Directory. I think what I'll do actually is I'll go ahead and I'll actually log in into my Active Directory and go ahead and show you this. If you don't mind not taking photos of this, that would be great. Okay. So
What about video?
I'm going to be blurring it out, believe it or not. So here we are. We're at the sign-in, right? You'll notice there's a little new thing that showed up actually, I think 6 months or 8 months ago to sign in with a GitHub login, tying it in. I would just log in here with your own email address when you're registering. But effectively, when you go to sign in, all right, and you'll see as soon as I go ahead and proceed through here with my domain, you'll notice that I actually have some branding going on, and that is in the form of just the word NetCorp at the bottom. If I wanted to, I can put the logo, I can change the background, I can do all kinds of things like we talked about, right? And right here, after I put in my password, shoot, my phone is off because I'm recording. So let me try to do this. Let me wake my phone back up, and I'll have to make sure I still have my audio recording. But as soon as I sign in here, I'm actually going to get challenged with multi-factor authentication. It's going to tell me to approve the sign-in request. And we will see here in just a second. It should wake up and... Actually, I think it probably because I have Do Not Disturb on. Or I didn't wait long enough. Just a second.
Can you select Authenticator or mobile device?
Yes, you can actually pick whether you want to use Microsoft Authenticator. You can actually use Google Authenticator manually for this as well. I'd rather just be prompted, to approve the sign-in. Who's used Microsoft Authenticator? Okay, not enough people. So anyway, the app, I'll try to bring it up here, and as soon as I opened the app, and the reason it didn't prompt me is because my phone was locked and it was in do not disturb, okay? But it's prompting me to approve the sign-in. By the way, it prompts me on my watch too, which is really cool. All I have to do is reach over and hit approve. So I'm going to approve it, and unfortunately I didn't do it in time, which is just fine by me because we're going to do it again. We're going to send another request and we're going to check it out on my watch. Hopefully. Come on. Come on. I promise this is usually very quick. It's not. Apparently not good enough. I don't know. I'm going to have to just do it in the app, but it works well on the watch. Okay, I approved it, and it's letting me through. It's asking whether I want to stay signed in. If you're in a public space, or if you're in that admin session we talked about, don't keep it signed in, please. Otherwise, you can go ahead and say yes, yes or no. I'm going to say no, and that signed me in. Now, the reason that I'm taking you here, remind me what it was that oh yes, multi-factor authentication. So we're going to come in here real quick, and of course, I'm not signed in as my admin account, so that won't help us. But I will simply mention that you can get to it there. You can also get to it from here. You'll see a link for multi-factor authentication, and you can actually go ahead and enable multi-factor authentication for your users. The next time they log in, they're going to get prompted to set up the Authenticator app, right? And or use their phone for the text prompt with a code, and that will basically effectively go ahead and actually make sure that they're using multi-factor authentication. All right, any questions on that? You guys are not engaged enough. Come on. Do you need some coffee? There's some coffee out there. Espresso, champagne.
I asked for the options.
Everybody eat pizza. We got double order pizza. 4 pieces, everybody.
Yes, everyone take one home, please, or 2, or 3. All right, I won't go any further into this here as far as Active Directory is concerned. We talked about subscriptions. What I'd like to talk about now are resource groups, and then we will go ahead and we'll go back into the slides. So this is a list of resource groups. Resource groups are logical groupings of services and resources that we've deployed inside of Azure, and they can span what are called multiple regions, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide. I just wanted to show you here real quick while we have them. You can see what subscription we've tied that resource group to, and then if you dig into any one of these that have certain resources in them, I'll go into the web resource group, and we will see the different resources that are deployed in that resource group here toward the bottom. Let me go ahead and actually kick this up a little bit so everyone can see more. All right, so we have a MySQL database that David is working on, an app service plan, and a couple app services in there that David's looking to stand up our user groups website in. Okay, and we'll come back to app services in the next set of demos. So, and as far as role-based access control goes, this is an important point to make. Remember, I said you can assign permissions at any point in the hierarchy, right, in the tree. The hierarchy starts at the top, which is the subscription. So at the subscription, we can actually assign permissions there. We can assign permissions then at the resource group, or we can assign permissions to a specific resource within that resource group. So in every point in that hierarchy within the Azure portal, we have the IAM, Identity Access Management Access Control blade that shows up. It looks the same wherever we go. And from here, we can actually check access for a user and say, does this user have access? And if so, what kind do they have? We can also look at any role assignments that have been given here within this resource group, or are they inherited? And if they're inherited, where from? From the subscription? Or if we're actually at a resource, they'll say it might be inherited from the subscription, or it might be inherited from the resource group that contains those resources. Okay, so you can see where that permission set is coming in from. Just like NTFS file permissions, inherit down the tree, same exact story here. So just think of it like a file folder system. Subscription, resource group, resource. That's really how it's structured. And you can see the different permissions that have been given here. And you have a concept of tags. You can tag your resources. So you'll see as we deploy resources, you can tag them and give an arbitrary name value pair that you can give for billing purposes or administrative purposes. You can quickly seek out all resources that are part of the same category, for example. Or we've deployed all these things for California, and we're going ahead and putting that in there. Or everything that's production, right? So maybe you could say environment prod or production, environment dev. And you can actually quickly seek out, well, you know, where are all my resources for production? So that's actually really helpful as well. All right. And here, this view here is the all resources view, which allows us to effectively see each and every resource that's there. There's certain hidden types of resources as well that we can enable, and that will just extend this list. But we can then filter this down by the subscription, the resource group, etc. And really dig through what we have, okay? And with that, let me just go back to the actual slides.
Resource groups are especially good for demos because you put all your resources in one folder, you're done with the demo, delete the resource group, and it's all done. So you don't forget to leave something running on your account.
Right.
I have a brief video I'm hoping that you guys can hear the audio for, and if not, we'll just abort. But this was actually, I decided to pull because I think it's important to show a video of setting up the multi-factor authentication because there's not that many people in this room that actually have it set up or have used this. Let's hope that the audio passes through. Hold on, let's see.
Multi-factor authentication
Excellent.
provides more security for your business. Here's how you set it up. When you sign in, prompt it to provide more information. Select Next. From the drop-down menu, choose Mobile App, then choose how you want to sign in with your mobile app.
Now, this demo is going to pick use verification code. I wish it would have showed you the app. The only reason it did is probably it wants to show you, show entering the code, of course. Otherwise, you saw me, approve it inside of the actual app on my phone. But you can enter codes if you'd like as an option.
Choose Receive Notifications for verification to authenticate directly from your mobile app, which may include fingerprint authentication. Or choose Use Verification Code if you would rather enter a new verification code each time you authenticate. Then, Set Up. Now you'll need an app on your phone to continue, but leave this window open on your computer. On your phone, select your device's App Store. Search for the Microsoft Authenticator app. Select it, install it, then open it. Complete the wizard and select the plus sign to add your account. Choose work or school account. And
that's super important. If you ever see this, whether you're logging into the portal or Office 365, you're like, well, what's a personal account? And that, what it is actually known as a Microsoft Online account. It's an account that you've set up with Microsoft for things like your certifications or your Outlook personal account, things like that. And when you're working with Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, it's always a work or school account. And that's a distinguisher. And you can actually log in with the same email address that may have been previously a Microsoft Online account, personal account, and you now set it up under your own domain as an Azure Active Directory integrated account, and it will mean two completely different things. So keep that in mind, that you can actually, and to make it even more confusing, you can invite that Microsoft Online account into your Active Directory. And then you got a nice mess. All right? So, yes. So try to keep, if possible, those things separate. But really, just keep in mind, like if I'm logging in for my certifications, I'm logging in as a personal account. If I'm logging in for my business or my, then I'm logging in as a work or school account. Yes?
You use a Gmail for your work, it'll reject that, right?
So you wouldn't be able to use Gmail for a work. So work or school account will always be your own domain name that you've brought into Azure Active Directory as a custom domain and verified it like we looked at earlier, right? Or it's a something.onmicrosoft.com domain login. So either one that you're logging in with will always be a work or school account, but anything that's Gmail or one of the domains you don't own, that of course would almost always be a personal, will be a personal account. Sorry.
Then scan the QR code on your computer.
You guys get the idea.
Once the account has been added, select Got It, and then return to your computer. Select Next, then Next again, and return to your phone. Make a note of the code.
Or approve it, because they'll prompt you to approve it, if you're doing it that way.
On the computer, enter the code, then select Verify. Enter a backup phone number like your office number. Select Next, then Done.
Okay, now this is something I want to point out. Unless it's been turned off ahead of time in the MFA settings, this is an actual app password. And app passwords, you can have, your users can have one or more app passwords. And if this feature is not turned off, they will automatically get an app password. What this is for applications like Apple Mail, not iOS Mail, but prior to iOS 11 on the phone, okay, on an iPhone, iOS 10 didn't support what's called modern authentication. Modern authentication is being able to come out of the app, launch a browser, do Microsoft's multi-factor authentication prompts, and then come back into the app, and then the app holds on to something called an OAuth, or an open authentication token, okay? And it can actually then use that to always log back in. Outside of that, outside of a concept of OAuth tokens or modern authentication, older apps, old versions of Outlook, old versions of iOS or Android would have to have an app password. So if you have MFA enabled, that's what an app password is for, is to be able to bypass multi-factor authentication and actually go ahead and actually authenticate with your username. Any questions on that? So I think we'll go ahead and exit out of this for the interest of time.
That QR code that shows up when you log in and you take a picture of it with your phone, you can print that and keep a backup of it. So if you ever had to, you can always, maybe it's a company account and you keep it in the safe, and you can always re-authenticate or reassociate the authenticator with that account.
That's a good point. There's also backup codes, right? So you've seen backup codes at other places. You can also have backup codes here as well.
It's painful when you lose your code.
Yes.
You can also your device.
Vic?
You could also do passwordless authentication as well.
Passwordless?
Yep.
And how does that work?
You enable it on your tenant, and you don't have to put in a password. It'll actually just send the approval to your phone. There's a code on the screen.
You just taught me something there.
Yeah, so this shows you a number. I rolled it out. So there's a number on the screen, so 47 or whatever.
Yeah.
On your app, you'll have 3 numbers. You can pick the one that matches on the screen. And you log in without having to type in a password.
Okay. Very cool. Very cool. All right, so virtual machines, they're similar to your on-premise, and they're based on Hyper-V inside of Azure, but a specific flavor of it that's custom tailored for Azure. You can run multiple OSs on it. You can scale up and scale out. We'll look at that in just a second. And you can either use the images that are there, like snapshot images, to go ahead and launch stuff that Microsoft's provided for you and third parties have provided for you inside of something called the Marketplace, which we'll look at. Or you can create your own instances, images as well. So, like maybe you've installed your own custom apps. Let me go back. You've installed your own apps on a particular virtual machine image, and you want to be able to redeploy that image at any given time. You can save that image and redeploy it, so you don't have to go through installing all of your apps all over again. And virtual machine sizing, it's kind of like alphabet soup. So there's all kinds of different series and sizes of machines and what all of those do. For example, the B series is a burstable series. It's great for web servers that aren't always taking off, a lot of CPU usage. They're quiet a lot of times. They'll spike up every now and then. And what this allows us to do is to have more affordable virtual machines, because they're not charging us for the expectation of having to use the compute, the CPU all the time. So as the machine sits dormant or below 20% consumption of CPU, you'll start racking up credits. They're effectively CPU credits. And those credits are utilized whenever the CPU usage takes off under heavy load or times of day when a lot of people are logging in and so forth. So keep the B series in mind. It's really good for web and API servers that are not pegged to the wall at all times. D series is the most common one though that you will use, so you would equate for general purpose workloads. But you can look all these up on the Azure portal information pages.
Those are the standard builds, right?
Yeah, these are all the standard series. And these aren't necessarily builds. These are types of sizes of machines. So these are combinations. Within each one of these categories, you'll have combinations of how much CPU there is, how much memory there is, how many disks can you attach, and how much throughput to those disks can you have. And you'll have different varying within the F series and the E series. It's actually the E series. There's all kinds of combinations now where the E series is memory optimized. So for example, if you take the D series and you scale up and you say, oh, well, I need more RAM, but I really don't want more CPU, right? So if you jump from 2 to 4 CPUs, all of a sudden they're giving you double the RAM. And now all of a sudden it's far more costly. It's like, I really just need RAM. I don't need 4 CPUs. So in that case, you can get higher RAM ratios for a CPU out of, for example, the E series, okay? And so keep in mind that network throughput also affects disk throughput because they're effectively transferring disk I/O through the same network interface as well.
What if you just want to set up like a very simple play thing that has a little database and a little hello world type application? What series would that be?
So it depends for what use. If it's just a hello world to do some testing, you could use the B series. You could also use the A series, which is pretty cheap, but it's not that necessarily performant, for any kind of production workload. So for that one, you would, if it's going to production, it depends how often is it used. If it's not used excessively, then a B series might work, or even an A series. But D is a good, safe place to be. The D series is a good place to start, for something that might be, production use.
Question for you.
Yes.
I ran into a situation where we had to do load testing near the end of the year, and would we create, in order before production gets hit in January, we wanted to do that. What kind of situation are we running into where we're going to have to budget for a high CPU, high RAM situation, and then we would turn that off after we finish the load testing?
Those are great questions because let me go into real quick how that's built. Okay, and also you can change the size of your VM at any given point in time, but it will require a restart of your virtual machine. You'll shut it down, resize it, and start it back up. So you can change the series. You can also change the size within the series. Sometimes, though, a certain series will not be available within the region that you're in. So that's something that you want to be keeping in mind. You look at the Azure documentation, or when you go to launch it, it just will simply say it's not available in your region. Now that will typically, a lot of these things have standardized now, and they're available in practically all the regions. But just keep in mind that sometimes there's outlier edge cases where certain series or certain sizes within a series are just simply not available in that region. A good safe, there's older regions. There's like South Central is a super old region. In fact, it was, I believe, a Rackspace facility. And so it wasn't even originally a Microsoft data center. And it's got the most outages that have ever taken place in Azure is South Central, okay? Then Microsoft built East and West US. And then East 2 and West 2, and Central came in. Central and East 2 and West 2 are some of the newest regions inside of North America, okay? So those are the largest. They have the most data center footprint, and Office 365 and Power BI predominantly are hosted inside of Central US. Just so keep that in mind, that there's a lot to play with there and room to grow. Whereas like East US is starting to run out of space. They're significantly discouraging new accounts and users from deploying inside of East US. So there's a concept of scale sets where you can go ahead and actually deploy 2 or more, or really 1 or more virtual machines into what's known as a scale set. So we talked about having images earlier. You say I have an image, this is my web server, and it's got my software loaded on it, and now I want it to automatically, or I'll call it automagically, go ahead and actually scale up and scale back down when there's the Super Bowl or what have you, right? And you can have it scale up or down based on different metrics. Is it CPU use? Is it how much memory there is? Is it how many requests are queued inside of ASP.NET? for example. And you can actually tie those metrics in and have it scale accordingly and scale back down. So there's that neat capability. You also have redundancy, of course, because you have 2 or more instances. If you choose, you can choose how many minimum instances you want to run and how many maximum instances you want to run to cap your budget, so to speak. And also, how many minimum you want to have for performance reason, for high availability reasons, right? And you can integrate it with a load balancer and also something called an application gateway, which we just don't have enough time to go into. But those technologies are there. So fault domains, this is kind of important to understand a concept within a single data center. So let's back up. We have Azure regions. You've heard the regions, we just talked about them, right? Within each region, you can have multiple data centers. Within the data center, you can have multiple racks, obviously, of servers, right? So a fault domain is effectively a single rack with its own power, its own network. It's kind of a cube, think of it, of compute and storage. It's all accessible inside of a single rack, so to speak. It's not, Microsoft has different, architecture that's there. It's not your conventional data center. Dave, do you mind opening that door to let a little more air possibly? And I think Microsoft's building shut off the chiller on the roof. But so a fault domain is saying within that rack, something could go wrong, and we could lose the resources that are inside of that fault domain. By you using a scale set or by you using an availability set, which we'll talk about in just a second, it allows you to say, I want my virtual machines deployed into different fault domains, and I want you to ensure that they're deployed into different fault domains for the duration of my deployment. This way, we can make sure that web server A is on one rack and web server B is in a different rack, right? And if there's a catastrophic issue with rack A, our other web server is still running. So that's our first level up of redundancy and high availability that we can have inside of Azure. There's a concept of availability sets, and you'll see here what I just described is putting one of each type of server, or 2 of each type, or more of each type of server inside of its own fault domain. Think of it as its own rack. Okay? And so then we have also a concept of update domains. So update domains are Microsoft imposed updates on the host operating systems that are running our virtual machines and other resources inside of Azure. So it could be our app services and so forth. Okay? And when they go to release Windows updates on their hosts, or they have vulnerabilities, or there's that type of maintenance taking place, not a fault, but a planned outage, a planned maintenance, update domains allow us to actually ensure that we are putting our fault domain spread load. Okay, so when we have 2 fault domains, for example, here's an example of having 3 fault domains. Okay, and let's just say for just a second that we deployed a web server into each fault domain. We can have update domains within these fault domains to ensure that when Microsoft goes to reboot that host, we still have other web servers running. So you're saying, whoa, so I'm running a virtual machine and they're going to just shut it down at any given time of the day. They actually send out notifications. They actually send out service health alerts that you can subscribe to, and it'll tell you, hey, your resources in that region for this subscription are going through a maintenance window this Sunday morning from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. So expect your virtual machines to be bounced, to be rebooted. And that's a great example of what can happen. You can plan for it accordingly. They give you enough time. You can actually manually manipulate things and say, okay, well, I'm going to make sure I have other servers up or what have you. But you don't really control whether they're going to do so or not, right? It's up to them to do that. So you can make sure that you can use multiple update domains to survive that, so you don't have to get involved. And then we take it a step up, which is availability zones. And this is actually different data centers within the region. And this is a new concept that Microsoft introduced in the early part of 2018 after having other outages that were catching the news. And Amazon had always had the concept of availability zones. Okay, so Microsoft was forced to invest billions of dollars and actually start creating a concept of availability zones. Even though they had other buildings, they didn't allow us to select that we were sticking it into building 1, 2, or 3. Okay, data center 1, 2, or 3. So now we can actually go ahead and do so. So we can pick not just for virtual machines. This can be for app services, this can be for SQL servers, etc. you can, lots of services now allow you to pick the availability zone. Yes, sir.
The availability, but you're mentioning that you can basically pick an actual building?
Effectively, you're picking a number of 1, 2, or 3. You don't know which building is 1, 2, or 3. Okay, but within the context of your subscription, 1, 2, and 3 will always be 1, 2, and 3 to you. Yes, sir.
Just to the last 2 slides. So you've got your regions, hierarchy on top.
Yes, sir.
Then you have your zones.
Yeah. You have your data center zones. Yep.
And then you have your fault domains.
Yeah. So.
And then with your fault domains, you can also you can do that manually when they give you that. When they give you the email, whatever, the notification, or you can script it where it's automated. And you could actually, you don't have to worry about it, because if for whatever reason it goes down, in another instance comes up.
So you'll get a notification that there's going to be maintenance within a certain subscription, okay, within your account. If you have things, and it'll only go by a single availability zone. They actually won't do it to more than one availability zone in that maintenance window. Okay, so if you're already spread across more than one availability zone, you're already in a different update domain. Okay. If you're within one availability zone and you've not deployed it into separate availability zones, you've not selected availability zones, you've just said I'm in this, I've stood up one instance or 2 separate instances, and you haven't put them into what's called an availability set within that zone. If you are within one zone, then you stand a chance that they will both possibly go down in a remote edge case.
Okay.
You can't guarantee that it's going to stay up. Okay. Dedicated hosts is something new inside of Azure. More recently, you can deploy bare metal instances, okay, which AWS allows you to do. So you can actually deploy bare metal servers, and you put your virtual machines on that. And the way that that works in the portal, we won't have time to go into it, but you've created something called a host group. The host group can live in these availability zones, and we can go ahead and start deploying hosts within those zones. And then you can start deploying virtual machines into each one of those hosts, and you actually dictate all that. Okay.
So those bare metal machines,
yes,
those things that are in the slots in a rack, they actually are assigned to you.
100% to you. And the smallest instance that I saw was 64 CPUs. So 64 cores are assigned to you in one dedicated server. And the nice thing about it is you can have data center edition of Windows. Let me just go ahead and touch on licensing real quick with virtual machines. You have something called a Azure hybrid benefit. What that means is that you have a Windows server license on premise. It may be one you're already using, okay? And you have software assurance. This is super important. You have to have software assurance, which is that 3-year subscription that you purchase to have continued upgrades over 3 years. And you can renew that. And if you have software assurance for that license, you can bring it to the cloud. Okay, it's called a hybrid use benefit. It's actually technically a one-way path and it's an honor system. So if you get audited by Microsoft, make sure your books are straight. But it's an honor system that you're going to take your Windows standard or data center license and move it into the cloud. And the standard instance, I think, awards you up to 4 vCPUs. Is it 4? Do you know? Do you remember? Is it 4 VC? I don't know. So I think it's 4 cores. If you have data center, I think it awards you something like 16 or more cores. I forget what it is. But if you move data center into a bare metal instance, it's the entire server. So you can put as many virtual machines as you want on that server and not pay more for licensing. This can, not only in just the dedicated space, but in your virtual machines, this can get very cost effective, because on larger, more costly VMs that are over $300 per month, typically, you save 43% on that $300, okay? And even $800 instances, you're gonna be saving close to $400 per month. On top of that, and I didn't have it in this slide deck for licensing, so we're still going into this real quick, but there's a concept of reservations. So for 1 year, I wanna pay for this size of instance, and let's just say you had 4 of them, and you want to pay for 2 of them, and you want to get 2 for a discount. Okay, maybe you want to get all 4, so you can agree to pay for all 4. but you're committing to 1 year or 3 years of monthly billable charges for that instance that you can't go below. So once you buy, you can't reduce, but you can always upgrade, okay, if you'd like, or you can split it and say, I want 2 smaller instances instead of this larger one. As long as the cost, it doesn't reduce to you, that'll save you another 33%. Okay, so now we're looking at $500 virtual machines costing us $140 a month. Yes, sir.
Can we go back a little bit?
Yeah.
So these bare metal servers, who owns these servers and who provides these services?
Microsoft.
So you just buy, rent, or how does it actually work?
You're renting. You're technically renting by the month or by the year.
Do you define the configuration, or Microsoft tell you that this is what we have and you can rent or buy these servers?
So what I saw as of yesterday when I looked at it, just for the purposes of putting the slide together, there were 3 sizes of physical servers that you could pick, each one with different CPU counts and amount of RAM. And they load the OS still on, right? They're loading their custom Hyper-V Azure, hypervisor, OS, and then they're allowing you to deploy Azure virtual machines into that dedicated server.
Okay. Question: what's the difference between lots of data centers around
Mm-hmm.
versus Microsoft data center? Because they provide these additional cloud services?
Yeah, because you can then have your virtual machines running within the concept of your virtual network inside of Microsoft's, Azure cloud, consuming those other services that you might want to use, and also benefiting from all the other services that they have, like site recovery and the backup technologies that I can go into a little bit. But basically, using all those additional features and ensuring that your data and your compute is not being shared with other customers.
One last question.
Yes.
How does these resources or bare metal, which I can be sure that it will provide me certain performance, can these resources be integrated into the Azure portal and be part of the Azure portal?
It is.
And use part of the bare metal and part of the Microsoft?
100%. 100%.
Is there an SLA so
Yes.
the performance is guaranteed?
Yeah, well, your performance is, you'd have to look at the fine print. It's the virtual machine SLA is there. In fact, I believe that will still be the same. So, and we'll look at the SLA differences here in just a second. Okay. In fact, I think it's coming up real soon. There's a concept, and you'll see that real quick. There's a new thing, it's in preview, proximity placement groups. So even within a single data center, right, within a single availability zone, we talked about fault domains, right? So do you want to have the ability to keep the load separate in different fault domains while still keeping it close? What that means is I'm not crossing over to another rack for my storage, or I'm making sure that I'm not prone to latency from other customers. So they'll make sure that you're in the same cluster, you're within the same set of servers in a rack with the same networking that is redundant with fault domains. But it just allows the proximity to be reduced to have higher performance in the network tier between those virtual machines. Maybe you have your SQL servers, with high, data loads replicating, etc. This is Azure Site Recovery. I just mentioned Site Recovery, also known as Azure Backup. The technology is kind of interchangeable as far as the terminology. So it allows us to not only back up resources and workloads inside of Azure, but even on-premise. You can install Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery onto your Hyper-V and your VMware servers as well, and back those up to Azure with the ability to basically effectively turn them on in the event of a disaster recovery, which is really cool. So it's replicating your on-premise virtual machines up into Azure storage, and it's synced almost to the minute, as however big of a internet pipe you have to keep up with it. And in the event that you need to flip the switch, it can actually bring up virtual machines inside of Azure with all of your data intact.
And is it still doesn't cost you to put up?
Yeah, there is a cost per month for a virtual machine to be protected, that your on-premise machine to be protected. I think it's $25 per month per on-premise virtual machine. But there is no cost to push data into the cloud. Keep in mind that they want you to bring your data, okay? Right. So all bandwidth into these clouds is free. As soon as you want to bring stuff out of the clouds, now you're going to pay, right? Okay. But it's even then, I think it's relatively affordable from a bandwidth standpoint. But you will pay for storage of your site recovery plus that $25 fee that I mentioned for your on-premise protected workloads, okay? And this is the site recovery that we talked about happening within Azure itself. You say, well, why would I need this within Azure? Cross-regional, if you want to go ahead and actually fail cross-regionally, I have a virtual machine in US East, I want to fail to US West, you can actually use Azure Site Recovery to be replicating those virtual machines like we do at my workplace. And you can actually have them replicating to another region at the storage level and be able to start those up automatically in the other region should your primary region fail. Okay?
Excuse me, question.
Yes?
If you have your own on-prem, size servers, and you would like to back up on Microsoft Azure, in case of failure of primary, can you consider this backup as a DR kind of like environment where you can launch all these VMs, but on Microsoft side?
Yes, 100%. That's exactly what this is for. Yes. And when you do Azure Site Recovery, you pick what kind of storage you're going to be, backing up to. And if you back up to something called geographically redundant storage, it's actually not only going into one Microsoft region, it's going into another. So even if that region goes down for Microsoft, you can still have your data on another region as well. Okay? And always the geographically redundant storage is in region pairs. So, for example, East US is always paired with West US. And that may not be advantageous for you. You can say, well, we're in Florida. I really don't want the latency over the network of now all my servers being in California. Not to mention the cost, because California has a lot of additional taxes and the electricity is more costly there. And you will actually pay more for a virtual machine and for storage in California than you will in the East, okay? Yeah, he's like, ooh. So that's where the Azure pricing calculator, Google for it, is really helpful, and you pick your different regions and you'll see prices fluctuate. But the main one is California. All the West regions get a little more pricey, okay?
What's the cheapest region?
So really, the prices are the same for Central and East and South Central and North Central. They're all the same. So it's really just like I just touched on, West is really your premium. And Central US is paired with East US too. And Central is in Iowa and is pretty efficient from a latency standpoint as East is. My favorite is pairing East US 2 with Central. That's just especially for Florida. So high availability options that we talked about, I just want to go ahead and touch through these, right? So we have a single virtual machine has only 3 nines, which we'll see on the next slide how much that really is. A virtual machine in an availability set increases us, as far as our uptime. And using availability zones is the best that we can do within a single region. But if we use multiple regions, we can effectively have 100% SLA, because we can have multiple regions up and available to us and redirect traffic there. And we can redirect that traffic manually, or we can redirect it automatically using something which is called Traffic Manager, which uses DNS and plays around with DNS and all of a sudden starts telling your clients and your users, hey, this is a new IP address and it's now in Central. It's not in East anymore. Here's the new IP. Start coming over here. And here are the different service level agreements. So what we looked at, you could have up to 8, almost 9 hours, 4 hours, or only 52 minutes within a single region if you make use of availability zones, and this is per year, and that's why I really encourage you to please look at availability zones. It's a substantial difference. And of course, we talked about using multiple regions. You can technically sustain, any outage, hopefully. Okay, so let's just do a quick demo on virtual machines. I know we've had meetings at this room go till 8:30. I just want to be sensitive of people's time. So how long are you comfortable staying here? Because I can take it all the way to 8:30 if you want.
Good. Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, that's
okay. Sorry, starting to sweat. I don't know about you. All right, so let's go ahead and do that real quick here. And let me go do the demo on virtual machines. Okay, so for the purposes of here, we'll go to the virtual machines blade, okay, as it's called, or section. And we're going to go ahead and actually we could click here at this create button because we don't have any, or we can click on add, which is what I'm going to do. And as soon as this tells me, okay, there we go. All right, so first thing we do when we come in here, you'll notice that there's different sections, and we can walk through these different sections by clicking on them, or we can use the wizard at the bottom, next and previous, right? We have the different subscriptions that we want to deploy into. I'm going to deploy into the pay-as-you-go subscription, and because the free one might be out of resources at this point, I think it's already past its 30 days. And we can go ahead and deploy them into an existing resource group, or we can create a new one. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. We're going to call this MCSFUG Demos. And I'm going to end this with RG. You can call it whatever you want. There's actually a best practices document from Microsoft on naming conventions, on how you should name things. But I'll leave that for you to look up. A virtual machine name, we'll call this my VM01, right? We'll pick the region. We'll go to East US for East US 2 for this. And here are those availability zone and set options that we talked about. So if I don't pick infrastructure redundancy, then I don't get it. If I do pick availability zone, I pick one of 3 availability zones available to me. If I pick availability set, I have to create a new availability set that I'm going to go ahead and utilize. And it's super important to know that when you go to deploy a virtual machine, if you don't pick one of these options when you deploy it, you're going to be redeploying it. You cannot move a virtual machine into an availability set or back out of it. You cannot move it into using availability zones or not using availability zones. You have to go ahead and actually define that here from the get-go. Okay? And then image. What kind of operating system do we want to use? You can actually deploy Windows 10 Pro, or you can deploy the data center editions here of Windows Server and a bunch of different Linux distributions. You can also browse all of the public and private images. We talked about being able to create our own images for virtual machines. That would go under My Items. I don't have any right now. But you can see here that, and by the way, this list just keeps going, of different types of images that we can deploy. And you'll see who is offering them. In this case, you'll see that there's something from OpenVPN and then all these Microsoft images. And I just want to point out the small disk options. Okay? Microsoft at one point made a transition about a year and a half or 2 ago where they started deploying all virtual machines with a C drive of 128 gigs, which you're paying for extra storage. You may not need that, especially if you're deploying a thin, web server or using server core here at the bottom, a small, user interface free version of Windows Server. So small disk allows you to automatically deploy with a 32 gig C drive. And that's what these images are for. So this would be an example of why you might pick, that option on the screen. Let me just close this before I lose my context. So that's an example, right? So we could go ahead and just deploy a Windows 2016 server, but I'm going to come back in here actually on purpose, and I'm actually going to search for SQL Server and Windows. And you'll actually see there's some free licenses for Developer Edition and Express Edition, and there's Standard and Enterprise Edition. So we're going to deploy SQL Standard on Windows Server 2016. And I don't know why it's complaining.
Availability set.
Yeah, there. Thank you, sir. Sorry, look up, Darius. All right, so this is an example of where we can pre-deploy something that already has SQL Server installed, and it's supported by Microsoft. Now, keeping one thing in mind, if we deploy something from Microsoft or a third party that has a licensable product included, guarantee you they're charging you for that product, for that license. So if you already have SQL Server license on premise, and it has a software assurance and SA agreement, you can actually bring your own license of SQL Server, but you cannot use these images. You're going to have to use the base image, log in, and download and install SQL Server, and then save your image. You can save the image, and you can find out how to do that. It's pretty straightforward and easy. Create a snapshot of the disk, and there's my image. Okay, and you can now have your own copy of SQL Server. But keeping in mind that here we would actually go ahead and be charged. I'm going to call this Windows Admin because it doesn't like me using the word admin from a security standpoint. All right, and then inbound port rules. So we can actually keep it sealed from the internet, or we can allow RDP access, for example, here, right? And this is that Azure hybrid benefit. Do you already have your own license of Windows, yes or no? And if you do, and you have software assurance, and you're going to no longer use that on-premise, you can say, yes, I do. And here's the type of disks that we want to use. There, you can look these up. There's different tiers of performance. I'm picking one of the higher tiers. And do I want to use managed disks? That's something that you should probably almost always pick yes to. There used to be a concept of non-managed disks, but it's messy and it's cumbersome and it's an old use case. And then the virtual network. So I have a virtual network here already defined. I could create a new one. I'm going to go ahead and use the existing one so that we don't have to create a new one. But you can define a virtual network with different subnets in it and actually have it however you want to do it with the IP addresses that you want, etc. Internal IP addresses. And you can connect your on-premise via VPN or using direct connectivity with something called Express Route, which you can use to connect your on-premise environment with Azure. All right, and then do we want a public IP address? In this case, I do, because I have no VPN to connect to this virtual machine with. So I'm going to go ahead and actually do a public IP. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but you can have a security group, and the security group is effectively a list of inbound and outbound firewall rules, but it's going to automatically go ahead and add RDP for us because we asked it to. All right, and there's some more options, and this just keeps going, as you can see. You want boot diagnostics, which will actually, I mean, we could keep going here all night. So each one of these sections of Azure can get more, as detailed as you want or as, high level as you'd like. So this is that host group. So this is the dedicated hosts that I talked about. If you were running a dedicated host, you can have a host group that you've defined, and the host group can be in different availability zones, and you can say, I want to deploy this virtual machine into that group. And once you pick the group, you pick the availability zone as well. Okay? And so I'm just going to move forward through this real quick. Port for SQL Server is going to be 1433. We're deploying it inside of the virtual network. Okay? We could say that we want it to be publicly accessible as well, and I'll go ahead and do that for now. That will open up the whole. And it's talking about storage. It's going to provision a terabyte of storage with this much performance. We can change how this is going to be deployed, but it will split up data, log, and temp DB for us, which is great if we want it to, or we can have it share it. And in this case, we're going to have it share it, just for the interest of time. All right. We want to enable SQL authentication. We're going to go ahead and give it a different username and password, because I don't have Active Directory enabled for now. And I'll talk to you separately about Key Vault at another time. So license. Actually, they added a feature finally. Do you have a SQL Server license that you're bringing? So apparently we can use the images. Look, it's great. I think last time I did this, we didn't have this option. Excellent. So this is really helpful. Do I have a license? Well, sure. And then this is really neat. We talked about automated patching of Windows and SQL, right? So we can't control what they do with the host. That was the update domains that we talked about. But our own virtual machine. Do we want Microsoft to patch our own virtual machine and SQL Server for us? Yes, sure. What time? Sunday morning at 2 a.m. Go. And it'll do that for us. So we don't even have to worry about it anymore while we sleep. And hopefully it reboots just fine. Right? And then backups, do we want it to automatically do backups? We talked about the tags, like is this, and they even have some predefined tags. So the environment is demo. We're going to call it demo. You saw that they even had the word production in there already. Although I think, David, that's from you. David created the environment tag. David put the word production in there, and I'm slopping this up by putting demo all lowercase. And so I'm going to make sure that I treat you well here. All right? And review and create. You always have the review and create screen with everything you create in Azure, and it's telling us what our cost is per hour. It's 49 cents per hour. Sounds like a great price until you add it up by 700 and some hours. Yes, sir?
So this is just a general question. Why would you want to use the SQL Server on a VM like this as opposed to Azure SQL?
Okay, I'll touch on that in about 30 to 60 seconds real quick. Azure SQL Database is a proprietary database engine. It is not the full SQL Server engine that we're accustomed to and familiar with. It has a concept of tables and indexes and clustered, keys and so forth. It also can run your stored procedures as well. Certain TSQL commands do not work inside of Azure SQL Database, and Azure SQL Database does not have a SQL Server agent. It does not have integration services and so forth. It also has a struggle to do cross-database queries. So if you have things in multiple databases, you are now creating what look like linked servers between each and every database that you have deployed inside of Azure SQL Database. You also cannot run CLR-based stored procedures. And most importantly, a fact that very few people know about is something called transient fault exceptions. So what actually takes place is a transient fault is on, let's say, half of 1% of all of your requests, your query might be told to stand down because it's too costly compared to the 50 other queries that are trying to run at the same time in the shared environment. And you will actually be given a SQL execution exception, basically. And it's a transient fault exception inside of .NET or .NET Core. And you will actually either have to manually account for that in a try-catch block, or if you use Entity Framework, you need to make sure that your developers are properly activating the retry handler within Entity Framework. If you see me afterwards, I can show you a slide that I presented on SQL Saturday this weekend that shows how to do that inside of Entity Framework, how to activate the retry handler. And if you know that, and if you plumb it, then basically your code will automatically come back in 50 milliseconds or 80 milliseconds, whatever period of time the service told your code to try back in. Does that help answer your question? Awesome.
Well, is the Azure database cheaper than the SQL database?
Absolutely. So we could start it for pennies, per day, okay, and scale up from there. So here's the best decision point. If you have an existing application that you're transitioning and migrating into the cloud as is, use a traditional SQL Server database, SQL Server instance on a virtual machine, or use something called Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, which is a full SQL Server instance that they fully manage for us. Okay, there's still some limitations compared. Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. MI.
We're not expected to remember everything you're going over.
And that's why we're recording it just for you.
Enable or disable the VM?
Yes.
Enable it, when I want to use it, enable it.
Great question. He's asking what happens if I want to stop my VM or stop being charged for costs. If you stop the virtual machine inside of the OS only, if you shut down inside of Windows, your machine is still allocated, okay, and it's still racking up charges. You have to stop the machine inside of the portal or through PowerShell to deallocate your machine. As soon as you deallocate your machine, if you're using dynamic IP addresses, for example, the IP address will change on the next start. If you associate it with a public IP static that you pick, that you're willing to pay a couple bucks per month for, you can still keep your IP address and not pay for the fee. That's what I do personally. You can even schedule your virtual machines to shut down automatically at a certain period of time. So I always have mine shut down at 12:59 at night, and actually get an email that tells me about an hour ahead of time it's about to shut down. Would you like to extend it by 1 or 2 hours or indefinitely? And it'll come back to me the next night if I cancel it out, which is really neat.
But you would just stop it. You wouldn't delete it.
Let me just click create while this is creating. I can respond to that. I'm sorry, what was that?
You would just stop it. You wouldn't.
Yeah, you don't delete it. I just stop. Stopping the auto shutdown is the same thing as deallocating and stopping, and that's exactly what I do with my primary VM for me personally.
But that's for a VM if you stop it.
Yes. Certain things you cannot stop.
And you don't deallocate it. But if you stop an app service or
you're still being paid. Yeah, so certain services you're going to still be charged for. In the case of a VM, you will still be charged for the storage that you had attached to the VM, but you're not being charged for the VM itself.
Is there any way to stop an app service and have the price go down?
No, because the app service is, one or more app services are associated with an app service plan, okay? And that app service plan is what's your billable entity. And so that's going to keep billing you. You could resize the app service plan and make it smaller until you're not charged as much, and then size it back up and start your apps if you want. That's another way to do it. And this is deploying. You can see it's deploying. And we're just finalizing here the actual diagnostics, and you can see the deployment progress here as well. So we're going to let that fly, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. But now you can see how we can go ahead and actually create the virtual machine, okay? As far as connecting to it, once this is done, we'll get an IP address, a public IP address that we can RDP into because we allowed it to. We can also connect via SQL Server Management Studio, for example, to that IP address with the username that I actually picked. And we'll come back to this towards the end of the evening just in case it needs a few more minutes. Okay, it's relatively fast, but I don't want to miss discussing Azure App Service for you. All right. So virtual machines are infrastructure as a service, IaaS, and App Service is a platform as a service offering. We don't manage the virtual machines. We don't manage Windows updates, all that stuff. Everything is done by Microsoft for us, right? And this is a native offering. App Service doesn't live anywhere else, although you can run app services locally on your machine as a test. They don't live in another cloud. So keep in mind that if we're using App Service, this is not something that we can transport over to Google or AWS. All the different frameworks that we can actually go ahead and host inside of App Service, and it's forever growing. You can even host Azure Functions, which is a serverless technology inside of Microsoft, and you can actually host them inside of an app service. You say, why would I want to do that? Because if you actually have a large enough plan of Azure App Service, and you're paying a flat fee for that, and you have compute left over because you don't really have much going there, you have a web server or two or API server or two, and you want to make use of Azure Functions within your virtual network that's not publicly accessible to the internet, that you now have to block off from the internet, you can actually host it internally within your virtual network, as it's called, next to your VMs, and not pay per execution, because otherwise you're paying per execution. So this would allow you to make use of additional functionality inside of your app service plan without paying more for Azure Functions. One thing that people don't realize is that all the services offered by Microsoft, SQL database, Azure Functions, a lot of things that are there, even if you have deployed a virtual network, which think of it as it's like your own virtual little cloud, right, inside of Azure. This is my playground, my sandbox. When you go to connect from your virtual machine or your web server or your app service to SQL Server database, you're actually still going out to the internet, so to speak, to Microsoft's edge and coming back into their infrastructure. So they're coming up to like kissing the edge of Microsoft's internet connectivity and coming back in. Is that secure? Technically, yes, but some people would say, well, now I'm risking someone, invading that router, that firewall, whatever. I now need to, I want to keep it safe. So when Microsoft says you can host this or host that inside of your own virtual network, your own VNet, like you can Azure Functions, that's what they're talking about, is bringing it inside of your virtual network with private IP addresses that no one on the internet could access, even if you have the ability to block them with a firewall. So Azure Functions allows us to say, I don't want anyone but, what's your name? Kim. I don't want anyone but Kim to access it from Kim's IP address at her office or her home, right? You can block it that way, but nonetheless, you're still allowing some internet connectivity, and you're also allowing your virtual machines to still go out and talk to that Azure Functions instance, right? So this is allowing us to bring it inside. I know this is a lot of info, guys, but I'm just trying to provide you with as much as possible.
Can you also handle access through Active Directory?
Yes. As far as, you mean network access or?
Yes, or access to the apps and everything.
Yeah, you can restrict what can be accessed with Azure Active Directory on many of these services, but I was talking strictly about network connectivity. So App Service allows us to run either code directly or allows us to run what are called Docker containers. Has anyone heard of Docker containers? Who has not? Raise your hand if you've not. So basically allows you to package up your websites or your APIs, your API, your app servers and things like that, and put them into kind of like a little image that you can run. Think of it like a virtual machine within a virtual machine. So now you can have compartmentalized little apps that are running that can be deployed fast. So you've heard, oh, the cloud, limitless scale. We can, scale. That's what they're talking. Containers are really small, and they're usually running on Linux because they don't have a big footprint of Windows OS. And you can just deploy all these little containers and scale them up inside of virtual machines. Okay?
Azure Functions is similar to AWS Lambda?
Yes, AWS Lambda is the same as Azure Functions from a functionality architecture standpoint. Yes. All right. So we have different tiers in App Service. We have the free and shared tier, basic, standard, premium, isolated. You can see that we increase in performance and share less infrastructure with other customers as we move through. So isolated is actually on dedicated hardware. Everything runs on dedicated hardware, right? And we have built-in load balancing with seamless scaling automatically, right? So let me go ahead and actually very quickly do this demo. Let me see where our VM is. Unfortunately, it's still creating. When I did this on Saturday, it actually flew within 5 minutes. It was done. I guess we're asking a little too much at this hour. But we'll go to app services real quick. So we actually, when you go to deploy an app service, and man, it's slow today. When we go to actually deploy an app service, we'll just pick the same demos resource group. You can see there's a pattern, subscription and resource group every time that we deploy something. We're going to call this MCSFUG demo app service. I know it's a little bit long, but it has to be unique across this azurewebsites.net domain. We can deploy code or we can deploy a Docker container, okay? And we can go ahead and pick what kind of code we are looking to deploy. Okay, all kinds of versions of PHP, .NET, .NET Core, pick the region, etc. Now you might be curious why I'm about. Yeah, go ahead.
3's not there yet?
Not in this context here, but you could deploy 3 inside of a container, and it would be just fine. So you would deploy it as a Docker container. So we can go ahead and deploy from here, okay, or and then go ahead and push code from Visual Studio, for example, and publish out of Visual Studio. We don't have time for all that. But I also wanted to show you that you can actually deploy certain resources in the portal from create a resource on the top left, which is what, if you remember, we were looking at the list of virtual machine images before from what looked like a marketplace. That's what this is, okay? This is the marketplace, and we're looking now to deploy something here. In this case, we want to deploy an app service, right? But we want to deploy, let's say we want to deploy WordPress. Well, we're going to go ahead and actually search for all WordPress images inside of the marketplace, and you'll see that we actually have the ability to deploy WordPress. And that's what David, I think, is this what you used, right?
I can go with the Linux, the WordPress on Linux. The app service plan is based around a Linux VM, or the first one here, this is how it's been working up to the point where they added Linux, where that's running on like an IIS, like a Windows web server. The WordPress, the first one that's there.
Yep.
And there's a flavor where you can deploy this Docker container, and it goes on. So they like to use WordPress as like a reference architecture for these deployments.
Yep. So we'll click on WordPress on Linux. Okay. We'll hit create, and it'll present us with, and I don't know what it just did from a user interface standpoint here, guys, but let me try this just one more time. That was not normal. Let's try that. And our virtual machine deployed. Check it out. We'll go look at that. I'm gonna let me just do this in a different. I was trying to open in a different window. Okay, so app name MCSFUG. Let's call this WordPress demo. Okay, nice and long here. We don't have to be, but we pick our subscription. Do we go into an existing resource group or a new one? We'll pick the existing one. And then we have to always have an app service plan, all right? And we have an app service plan here that David already has deployed. We can deploy a new one. We'll call this MCSFUG demo plan. And this is going to be where are we installing it. We'll just pick East US 2 for now. And then the tier, I'm actually picking a premium tier just for the sake of trying to get this deployed quicker too. Keep in mind how big of a VM you deploy and so forth can dictate how long it's going to take. And this is the database server. So WordPress needs MySQL. So it's also going to go and deploy a MySQL database for us, all right, which is pretty neat. And we'll pick a user here. And what version of MySQL do we want, and what size of MySQL database do we want? And I'm actually going to go with just a basic tier so I'm not charged too much. How much storage do we want? Okay, I definitely don't need too much storage for WordPress. I'm going to hit continue. This is the database name. My SQL, we'll call this WP database, and we can take the numbers off if we want as well, but I'm just going to leave them there. I just put them there to make things a little bit more random for us. And there we go. Let's go ahead and hit create. And while that is creating, and while that deployment is in progress, we're going to go back to our virtual machines, okay? And this is the beauty of the cloud. We can go off and do other things while our deployments are running. So here we have the public and the private IP address for this virtual machine, okay? We can go ahead and copy the public IP. We can also click connect, and connect will actually go ahead and prompt us with a download file for RDP that we could store on our desktop, double click and go. Okay, I could do it that way, or I'm going to do it the hard way because I like to suffer in misery and pain. And I'm going to go ahead and start RDP up, and we're going to go ahead and paste this IP address in here. We could associate DNS with this as well. I'm just not going through that step right now. And who remembers what the admin account was?
Windows admin.
Thank you. Just making sure you're still awake. All right. And let's go ahead and connect. And this is just your typical certificate validation because this VM is not on our domain. If it was in our Active Directory, even though it's in Azure, if we had it in our Active Directory and joined, we wouldn't be prompted for that. And
these are static IP addresses.
It's dynamic. I didn't pick a static one. So by default, it will deploy with a dynamic. You can flip the switch, put the checkbox on static, and pay a little more. And yes.
Do any of the plans have like a certain number of dynamic addresses, dynamic IP addresses?
So you can have when you say plans.
The service plans, like
app service plans.
App service plans.
Well, we're looking at virtual machine right now, but you can dictate whether you want things to be public or dynamic or static, and or public or private. So you can enable that public IP. So here's our VM, okay. And let's take a look and see how it's deployed the storage for us. And it's just taking a second. Very first user that logged into it, and you know what happens with Windows. So, all right, so here we go. So here's our C drive, and there's a D drive, which I'll just simply say it's an SSD local on that host of the virtual machine that's running, and you lose the data when you reboot. But that's a great place to stick tempdb if you're a SQL DBA, okay? So you can actually take advantage of really fast storage local on that host. And when SQL Server restarts, you lose all the contents in tempdb anyway. So when you restart your host, you'll recreate tempdb. Just keep in mind you have to use PowerShell and keep SQL from starting automatically because you need to go and create your directory structure where you're going to stick tempdb before you start SQL. So here you go. Here's our here's our data folder, which is currently empty because this is where the user databases are going to go. And we have SQL Server installed on here, SQL Server 2017, right? And there we go. So now, yes, sir.
Looking at it the next day right now. Are you still in East region?
I believe it was East 2 that we deployed into.
It's 11 o'clock. It's right
Oh, it's okay. Good question. So hold on a second. I'm trying to find what happened to my SQL Management Studio. Just hold on, guys. This question about the time. Let me just make sure I got this here. Yes, so it's UTC because if you are deploying to, you can change it. You can make it East. Okay, you can change all these VMs to be East, and it's comfortable for you. In a enterprise setting, we always use UTC for everything so that when we have things deployed across time zones and we're all consolidating all the log activity for security audits or things like that and correlation, we don't have to do brain damage. We know that 1 a.m. was 1 a.m. UTC no matter which server, which service across the globe was affected. Yeah, no worries. I'm just helping everyone else understand. Okay, so let me move this window over to here. Let me put my password in. And you'll see the IP address is probably wrong. Let me just, that's probably from New York. No, I can't use localhost because I'm connecting from my, I'm sorry, this is confusing. I'm sorry. I'm using Management Studio on premise and I'm trying to drag that window over here and it's not working. Okay, This is, I connected to that database server, to that SQL server that we just deployed.
Wait a second, but you opened on the RDP.
Yeah, so here, okay, again, I apologize for that, folks. Here's my RDP session, okay? Here's my RDP session, I'm minimize.
No, when you were configuring VM, you opened on the RDP, you didn't open 1433, as far as
I did open 1433 when we configured it. I told it to let 1433 in as well. I told it, go ahead and allow SQL Server public access over 1433. All right, so again, you guys saw that, right?
You connect to localhost if you're on that VM.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so there we go. Full-blown SQL Server deployed in the cloud, accessible to me. And right now, it's accessible to everyone. But
Thank you.
But here's what's cool. You go to networking, and remember I mentioned security groups, so inbound port rules. You'll see that 3389 is allowed, right now from everywhere. But I could just go ahead here and say that the source is my IP address and put my IP address in here, or my subnet range for the office, my public IP range just for our office here in South Florida, and then shut down the other opening here. Okay, it's just a standard firewall rules, inbound and outbound rules here. And these are, yes? Question? Someone?
With that RDP access, could you specify that you get the little code on your app?
You mean the multi-factor authentication?
Yeah.
You would have to tie that in more at the virtual machine level, and it's usually a third-party solution. That's a good question. There is no multi-factor option, I don't believe, inside of Windows that's tied to, or you're going to prove me wrong. Please do, because I really want.
You could
Yeah.
use JIT.
Yeah.
Just-in-time access.
Okay.
So when you authenticate through it, it'll add your public IP to the NSG and temporarily for whatever you set it at.
How do I do that?
Huh?
Teach me, Obi-Wan.
So,
Oh, it's in Security Center?
yeah, once you get the Operator Security Center license, you
Okay.
go through the JIT process, MFA, all that. add
Really?
IP for a little bit.
And what's that called again?
Just-in-time access.
Just-in-time access. I'm reading something tonight, folks. Cool. Thank you for coming, Vic. I appreciate it. No, seriously, I do. We really want, I mean, I actually would love it if you can give a presentation at some point in the next 6 to 12 months. That would be great.
Yeah.
Come on. Come on. Okay, so here are the disks that were deployed, and I'm sorry that it's getting so warm in here. That was me. Sorry. C drive and D drive that we have, actually E drive, because we don't see the D drive. The D drive is that ephemeral local SSD on the host, and these are the two OS and data disks that were deployed. We can add more here. Yes, sir?
Are these drives with allocated space or dynamic allocation? In other words, is it kind of a pre-allocated, that the data is 1 terabyte?
1 terabyte.
And is it pre-allocated already?
Yes.
Like,
Well, it's probably thin allocation, probably from a SAN standpoint, but we don't see that. But we are assigned that much. We can have a volume, an NTFS volume that big right now. And we can extend this, we can expand this and expand the NTFS volume as well if we want. We can add additional disks, okay? And here's that size option. If we stop the VM, we can actually go ahead and resize the VM to a different size and a different tier. Yes, sir?
One more page. Several
Yes.
times you mentioned that you can stop VM, but can you suspend and resume? In other words, if you have something open.
Where it keeps things in memory? No.
Yeah.
No, you cannot. All right. So that kind of covers that. I just want to very quickly show you the auto shutdown option for a virtual machine. You can enable it and pick a time and tell it to go ahead and send a notification like I mentioned earlier whenever it's going to go ahead and do that. That's a great way, in case you forget, to stop your $150 per month VM. It's definitely a useful feature. All right, I'm going to app services real quick, which we deployed. That did deploy successfully. You'll see that we have the WordPress deployed successfully. Before we go look at the app services, what else did I tell you it deployed? It deployed anyone? Right there. MySQL database. Azure database for MySQL. So it deployed one here as well, right? It deployed that resource. So we could actually go ahead and look at that, but I, in interest of time, won't. We'll go back to app services. We'll go to the WordPress demo that we just went ahead and created and wait for the URL to come up. And here's the URL, which we can alias from and any DNS actually. It doesn't have to be Azure DNS unless we want it to be accessible from, again, the root of the domain, the apex. Then we would have to bring our domain into Azure DNS services. And here's the WordPress setup screen. So you can see it's MCSFUG WordPress demo.azurewebsites.net. And I won't bore you with the WordPress install, but yes, sir.
And this is $150 a month?
No, this is actually probably, well, actually I did deploy the premium tier, so it probably is about $100 to $150 a month. But I could deploy a much smaller tier, for $20 a month. It would just take, yes.
That's better.
Absolutely, yeah. And please do make use of the Azure pricing. Just Google Azure pricing calculator, right? And it's a really great tool here that allows you to pick all the different things that you're doing inside of Azure, under compute. Is it a virtual machine? Is it an app service? And then you can go ahead and pick your different options and see your prices. All right. And we mentioned Cloud Shell. I'll just show you Cloud Shell real quick right now, and then we'll call it a night. Okay. So when you click on this little button right up here next to the search prompt, you will be presented with the Cloud Shell. Initially, when you click on it, it will ask you to just do a quick setup, and you can say quick setup and just let it go through. You don't have to pick any additional options. And then we'll get here into the screen. And I had picked PowerShell as my Cloud Shell, but you can also pick Bash, a Linux Bash shell if you'd like, okay? And you can go ahead and run PowerShell statements like get azvm, and it will go ahead and get a list of virtual machines that are running inside of my subscription, and that's the virtual machine that we actually went ahead and deployed earlier, as you can see. All right, tells us some information about it. You can use PowerShell in this, example, or you can use the Azure CLI. Sorry, it shouldn't be CLI. I always type CLI. So AZ is the Azure CLI, which is a list of commands that are not PowerShell per se, but they can be run inside of Windows or inside of Cloud Shell. And for example, azvm list, I believe, will get us a similar output, but you'll notice that it's in JSON format. How do I get that in tabular?
Double dash output.
Double dash.
Do text or table, I think.
There we go. Thank you, sir. Like I said, he is the shell king.
Who wants to learn about the shell?
Is that the same as Git Bash?
It's just like a Linux bash shell.
Git Bash
Yeah.
is derived from the same.
So no R minus R asterisk from the root.
No, but I do want to mention one thing real quick. You'll see here that it's a standard Linux, actually virtual machine that's been launched for us as a Cloud Shell, even though we're running PowerShell, okay, inside of Linux. It's really cool. And if we change to the home folder, okay, you'll notice that the home folder is home MCSFUG, okay? And that's simply the acronym that was given to me from the name of the Azure AD domain that we actually created, okay? And that's where my home folder is. Anything I put in this home folder will survive a restart of the Cloud Shell. If I don't put it in this home folder, it's gone, and when you reconnect, it won't be there anymore. So if you create scripts, make sure you stick them in your home folder or a folder underneath it, and they'll actually get stored in an Azure storage account, which you can go and download if you want, and manipulate as well. And it's just not enough time to go through all that today. So feel free to see me afterwards for any additional questions that you might have. I don't want to take anyone else's time, but I thank you so much for coming.